The ledger was found in 1891 tucked beneath rotting floorboards of a burned plantation house in southern Georgia. 28 years after the transaction, the handwriting was meticulous. 12 names, 12 ages ranging from 4 to 14. 12 prices totaling $8,400. All sold on December 25, 1863. But it was the final entry that made the county clerk's hands tremble. A single word written in different ink in a shaking hand that barely resembled the previous entries. Forgive. What the authorities discovered in the days following that Christmas would challenge every assumption about justice, guilt, and the weight of a single night. The master's name was Silas Harrove, and by dawn on December 26, something had changed him so profoundly that those who knew him claimed he was no longer the same man. Some said it was divine retribution. Others whispered of something far more terrifying. Something that came for him in the darkness of that holy night when the world celebrated peace and he had committed an act so cruel that even hardened men turned away in disgust. The truth, buried in testimonies, letters, and the fragmented memories of those who survived, is more disturbing than any legend. Because what happened to Silas Harrove that night wasn't supernatural. It was entirely, horrifyingly human. And what makes this story even more chilling is that every detail can be traced back to documented records, witness accounts, and the physical evidence that remained long after everyone involved had turned to dust. The Hargrove plantation sat 7 miles south of Valdosta, Georgia, on land that had been in the family since 1809. By 1863, it was one of the few estates in the region still operating at near full capacity despite the war that had been tearing the nation apart for nearly 3 years. While other planters had lost their labor force to Union raids or Confederate conscription, Silas Hargrove had managed to keep his operation intact through a combination of brutal discipline and geographic isolation. The plantation house itself was an imposing 2-story structure with white columns that had long since grayed with neglect. The paint peeled in long strips, revealing wood darkened by decades of humidity and heat. 6 windows faced the front yard, their glass warped with age, reflecting distorted images of anyone who approached. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and during heavy rains, water would drip through the ceiling of the second-floor hallway, creating a rhythmic sound that echoed through the empty rooms. Surrounding the main house were the quarters, 23 small cabins arranged in 2 rows, each housing multiple families. The cabins were constructed of rough-hewn pine logs chinked with mud and moss that had to be replaced every spring. Each cabin measured roughly 12 by 14 feet and housed anywhere from 4 to 8 people. There were no windows, only wooden shutters that could be propped open during the day. The floors were packed dirt and the roofs were made of cypress shingles that leaked during storms. Beyond the quarters stood the cotton fields stretching toward a line of pine trees that marked the edge of Hargrove land. 300 acres of cotton, though only about 200 were actively cultivated by 1863. The soil was red clay, difficult to work, and the yields had been declining for years. But Silas refused to acknowledge the decline, insisting in his ledgers that the land was as productive as it had been in his father's time. Silas Harrove was 47 years old in December of 1863. He stood just under 6 feet tall with a thin frame that had grown thinner over the years. His hair, once dark brown, had turned mostly gray, and he wore it combed straight back from a high forehead. His face was angular, all sharp lines and prominent bones, with deep-set eyes that rarely made direct contact with anyone. He had a habit of pursing his lips when he was thinking, creating deep lines around his mouth that made him look perpetually disapproving. Those who dealt with him in business described him as methodical, cold, and obsessed with maintaining control. He kept detailed records of everything: crop yields, weather patterns, expenditures, and the names, ages, and estimated values of every enslaved person on his property. His ledgers filled an entire bookshelf in his study, each one labeled by year and category. He would spend hours reviewing them, making notations in the margins, calculating projections for future harvests. But there was something else in those ledgers, something that wouldn't be discovered until after his death. Interspersed among the business entries were personal observations written in a smaller, more cramped handwriting. Brief notes about the people he enslaved. Ruth's boy Marcus shows aptitude for carpentry. Bess, age 4, sickly, may not survive winter. Thomas learning blacksmith trade, value increasing. These weren't compassionate observations. They were assessments, the same way a farmer might note which livestock were thriving and which were failing. Silas had been raised to view slavery as a natural order, an economic necessity, and a social structure ordained by God. His father, Nathaniel Hargrove, had owned the plantation before him and had instilled in Silas a rigid worldview. There were those who were meant to lead and those who were meant to serve. Questioning this order was not only foolish but dangerous. It threatened the entire foundation of their society. Silas had married in 1851 at the age of 35 to a woman named Catherine Brennan, the daughter of a wealthy merchant in Savannah. It was not a love match, but a practical arrangement. They had 4 children in quick succession. Catherine was a quiet woman, deeply religious, who spent most of her time in the upstairs rooms of the house, reading scripture and writing letters to her family in Savannah. She rarely ventured into the fields or the quarters, and she never questioned Silas's management of the plantation. But those who knew her said she seemed perpetually sad. In 1859, Catherine became pregnant with their 5th child. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. On a cold night in November, she went into labor. The baby, a boy, was born stillborn. Catherine hemorrhaged and died 3 hours later at the age of 32. Silas had her buried in the family cemetery. He never visited the grave after the funeral. The children were sent to live with Catherine's sister in Savannah shortly after their mother's death. Silas told people it was for their education and safety, but those close to the family suspected the real reason. He couldn't bear to look at them. They reminded him of Catherine, and Catherine reminded him of failure. With the children gone, Silas retreated further into his work. He spent 18 hours a day managing the plantation. He ate alone, slept alone, and spoke only when necessary. The enslaved families learned to avoid him when possible, to move quietly when he was near, to never meet his eyes. His only regular companion was Dutch Keller, the overseer. Dutch was a large man, over 6 feet tall and heavily muscled, with a thick red beard and small, cold eyes. He was efficient, brutal when he deemed it necessary, and utterly loyal to Silas. The winter of 1863 had been particularly harsh. The cotton harvest had been the worst in a decade. Silas calculated that he had lost nearly 40% of his expected yield. He was facing debts he couldn't ignore. In total, he was nearly $7,000 in debt with no clear way to pay. Then on December 15, he received a letter from Virgil Tate. Tate was a slave trader based in Macon, one of the few still operating in Georgia in 1863. The letter was brief and businesslike. Tate had heard that Silas was facing financial difficulties. He was prepared to make a generous offer for young slaves, ages 4 to 14, paid in gold. He would take as many as Silas was willing to sell, no questions asked, with payment on delivery. Silas read the letter 3 times. He sat in his study, staring at the words, calculating numbers in his head. 12 children. If he sold 12 at an average price of $700 each, he would have $8,400, enough to pay all his debts and have money left over for seed and supplies for the spring planting. He told himself it was business, just business. The children were eating food the plantation couldn't spare. They wouldn't be productive for years. Their parents would have more children. It was a practical decision, a necessary decision. It was what his father would have done. He wrote back to Virgil Tate that same evening, agreeing to the sale, 12 children, ages 4 to 14, to be delivered on December 25, Christmas Day. Payment in gold on delivery. He sealed the letter and gave it to Dutch to post the next morning. Then he poured himself a glass of whiskey and returned to his ledgers, trying to ignore the small, persistent voice in the back of his mind that whispered he was making a mistake. The selection process began on December 18, exactly 1 week before Christmas. Silas had a list of all the children on the property, 37 in total. He needed to choose 12. The criteria were simple. They had to be healthy, between 4 and 14 years old, and from families that wouldn't cause too much trouble. He made his preliminary selections on paper, writing 12 names in his ledger. Then he called for Dutch. Dutch arrived at the study just after sunrise. Silas showed him the list and explained the plan. Dutch listened without expression, then nodded. "When do you want to tell them?" Dutch asked. "Christmas Eve," Silas said. "No point in giving them time to make trouble." "They'll make trouble anyway," Dutch said. "You're taking their children. Then we'll deal with it," Silas said. But the sale is happening. Tate will be here Christmas morning with the gold. Over the next 2 days, Silas walked through the quarters and the work areas, observing the children on his list. He watched them play, work, interact with their families. He was looking for signs of illness, weakness, or behavioral problems that might reduce their value. The first child on his list was Bess, a 4-year-old girl who lived with her mother, Sarah, and 2 older siblings. Bess was small for her age, with large, dark eyes and a quiet demeanor. She rarely spoke, even to other children, and spent most of her time clinging to her mother's skirts. Silas noted that she appeared healthy despite her size, and her youth made her valuable. She could be trained for domestic work. The days passed slowly, cold and gray. On Christmas Eve, the air was still and heavy with the promise of frost. Silas spent the morning in his study, finalizing the paperwork. He wrote out a bill of sale for Virgil Tate, listing the 12 names, their ages, and their prices. The total, $8,400, was written in bold script at the bottom. He blotted the ink carefully and placed the document in a leather folder. That evening, just as the sun was setting, Silas and Dutch went to the quarters. Dutch carried a bullwhip coiled at his belt, a silent reminder of the consequences of resistance. Silas carried the ledger. They called the families of the selected children to the open space between the 2 rows of cabins. The adults came slowly, their faces drawn with suspicion and fear. The children stayed close to their parents, peeking out from behind legs. Silas stood on a wooden crate so everyone could see him. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice flat and emotionless. He explained that due to the hardships of the war and the poor harvest, difficult decisions had to be made. 12 children would be leaving the plantation the next morning. He read the names from his ledger. As each name was called, a wail rose from the crowd. A mother screamed. A father lunged forward, only to be stopped by Dutch's heavy hand on his chest. Bess's mother, Sarah, collapsed to her knees, clutching her daughter so tightly the child began to cry. The scene descended into chaos, weeping, shouting, prayers. Silas stood immobile on the crate, watching. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were observing a play. He nodded to Dutch, who began moving through the crowd, physically separating the selected children from their families. The children cried and reached for their parents. The parents pleaded, offered to take their children's place, promised to work harder. Silas ignored them. He stepped down from the crate and walked back to the main house, the sounds of grief fading behind him. He ate a cold supper alone in the dining room. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He tried to read but found he couldn't concentrate. The faces of the children kept appearing in his mind. He poured another glass of whiskey, hoping it would dull the unease. He told himself again it was business. It was necessary. He went to bed early but slept poorly, plagued by fragmented dreams. Christmas morning arrived cold and clear. The sun rose over the frozen fields, casting long, stark shadows. Silas was dressed and in his study by 6 o'clock. He heard the wagon arrive before he saw it. The sound of wheels on the frozen road, the snort of horses. He looked out the window and saw Virgil Tate's conveyance, a large, enclosed wagon drawn by 4 mules. Tate himself was a thin, sharp-faced man dressed in a dark suit. He climbed down from the wagon and was met by Dutch. Silas went outside to greet him. There were no pleasantries. "Do you have the gold?" Silas asked. Tate nodded and produced a heavy leather bag. They went into the study, and Tate counted out the coins on Silas's desk. $8,400 in gold. Silas checked each coin, then signed the bill of sale. Tate folded the document and placed it inside his coat. "And the merchandise?" he asked. "They're in the barn," Silas said. The 12 children had been taken to the barn at first light. Dutch had given each of them a piece of cornbread, which most were too terrified to eat. They huddled together on a pile of hay, the younger ones crying softly, the older ones staring ahead with empty eyes. Silas and Tate walked to the barn. Dutch stood at the door. Inside, the scene was heartbreaking. The children looked up as the men entered, their eyes wide with fear. Tate walked among them, inspecting them like livestock. He checked their teeth, felt their limbs, made them turn around. He nodded, apparently satisfied. "Load them up," he said to his 2 drivers, who had followed them in. The drivers began pulling the children to their feet and herding them toward the wagon. The crying intensified. Bess, the 4-year-old, refused to let go of the hand of her 9-year-old brother, Samuel, who was also on the list. A driver pried her fingers loose and carried her, kicking and screaming, out of the barn. Silas watched from the doorway. He saw Sarah, Bess's mother, watching from behind a cabin, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle her sobs. Their eyes met for a second, and in that moment, Silas saw a hatred so pure and deep it felt like a physical blow. He quickly looked away. The wagon was loaded. The door was closed and latched. Tate tipped his hat to Silas, climbed onto the driver's seat beside one of his men, and the wagon began to move. It rolled down the long drive, turned onto the main road, and disappeared into the morning mist. The sound of the children crying faded, replaced by an eerie, profound silence. Silas stood there for a long time, staring at the empty road. The gold was in his study. His debts were paid. He had done what he needed to do. He should have felt relief, or at least resolution. Instead, he felt hollow. He walked back to the house, the congratulatory words Dutch muttered to him not even registering. He went straight to his study, closed the door, and sat at his desk. He opened his ledger to the page with the 12 names. He dipped his pen in ink and carefully wrote the final notation of the transaction, December 25, 1863. 12 heads sold to V. Tate. $8,400 received in full. He stared at the entry. The ink was black, the letters perfectly formed. But it looked wrong, incomplete. A cold, factual record of something that felt monstrous. His hand began to shake. A drop of ink fell from the nib, smudging the page. Without thinking, he dipped the pen again. In the margin, in a space he never used for notes, he wrote a single word. His hand trembled violently, the letters sprawling and awkward, the ink a different shade, as if his soul had leaked into the bottle. Forgive. He dropped the pen as if it had burned him. He slammed the ledger shut, his heart pounding. He couldn't explain why he had written it. He didn't believe he needed forgiveness. He had simply done what circumstance demanded. Yet the word hung in the air of the study, a ghost he had conjured himself. He tried to go about his day. He instructed Dutch to distribute the usual Christmas rations of molasses and salt pork to the quarters, a meager gesture that now felt like a grotesque mockery. The silence from the cabins was heavier than any wailing. He took his dinner alone, but he couldn't eat. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the children's faces. He heard the latch on the wagon door closing. As night fell, the temperature dropped. A bitter wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house. Silas built up the fire in his study and tried to drink himself into numbness. It didn't work. The whiskey only sharpened his senses. The house creaked and groaned. Every sound made him jump. He felt a presence, a weight of watching eyes. He told himself it was guilt, a weakness of spirit. He was a rational man. He did not believe in ghosts. Sometime after midnight, exhausted but unable to sleep, he left his study to go upstairs to his bedroom. The house was dark, lit only by a single candle he carried. The wind shrieked like a living thing. As he passed the grand staircase, he froze. He heard something, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, almost lost in the wind. The sound of a child crying. It was coming from upstairs. His blood ran cold. It was impossible. The children were gone, miles away by now. It was the wind, tricking his mind. He forced himself to climb the stairs. The crying grew louder with each step. It was a small, hopeless sound, coming from the closed door of the nursery, the room his own children had used, empty for years. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He pushed the door open. The room was dark, the furniture covered in sheets. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes in the air. The room was empty. The crying stopped abruptly. Silas let out a shaky breath. His imagination, stress and whiskey. He turned to leave. Then he heard it behind him. Not a cry, but a whisper. A single word, spoken by a small, clear voice directly into his ear. Forgive. He spun around. The room was still empty. A paralyzing terror, colder than the winter night, seized him. He stumbled backward into the hallway, his candle extinguishing. In the pitch dark, other whispers began. They swirled around him, not from one direction but from all sides, a chorus of young voices. Why, Mama, don't let go, it's cold, forgive. He fled down the hallway, crashing into walls, disoriented by the darkness and the unbearable chorus. The voices weren't accusing him. They were just present, confused, sad, lost. They were the echoes of the questions the children had been too frightened to ask, the pleas they hadn't been able to voice. They were the sound of his own transaction, reflected back at him not as business but as shattered human lives. He ran downstairs and locked himself in his study, but the whispers seeped under the door. They were in the rustle of the papers on his desk, in the crackle of the fire. He opened the ledger to tear out the page, to destroy the evidence of his own unease, but the word forgive seemed to pulse on the page. He threw the book across the room. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. He saw fleeting shadows of small figures in the corners of his vision. He felt tiny, cold hands brush against his own. The rational part of his mind screamed that it was a breakdown, a product of exhaustion and moral conflict. But the experience was utterly, terrifyingly real to him. When dawn finally broke, the phenomena ceased. The house was silent again, save for the normal sounds of the wind. Silas emerged from his study a broken man. His hair, overnight, seemed to have turned fully white. His eyes were wide, vacant, staring at something no one else could see. Dutch found him sitting on the front steps, muttering to himself, flinching at nothing. In the days that followed, Silas Harrove was unrecognizable. He could not bear to be in the ledger room. He would wander the empty nursery for hours. He ordered Dutch to bring all the remaining families from the quarters into the main house, insisting they take the bedrooms. He gave away the stored food, the blankets, the clothing. When confused neighbors came to call, they found former enslaved families living in the master's rooms, and Silas himself sleeping in a corner of the kitchen, a blanket around his shoulders, staring into the middle distance. He spoke of voices, of cold hands, of a question he could not answer. The authorities were summoned. They found the ledger, with its meticulous entries and its final, desperate scrawl. They heard the testimony of the families, who spoke of the Christmas Eve selection and the morning wagon. They heard of Silas's transformation. Some called it madness, a guilty conscience made manifest. Others, remembering the weeping they thought they heard on the wind that Christmas night, called it justice. Silas Harrove never recovered. He was declared incompetent. The plantation fell into disrepair and was eventually sold to pay his debts, the very debts the gold from the 12 children had once cleared. He lived out his days in a small room at the back of a distant relative's house, a silent, trembling figure who would sometimes, on cold Christmas nights, be heard whispering a single word back into the darkness that seemed to whisper to him, "I cannot." The ledger was all that remained. A dry record of a transaction, and one man's hopeless, unanswered plea etched forever in its margin. It was not a ghost story. It was a story of a man who, in the stark light of a Christmas dawn, finally saw the true cost written in his own neat columns of figures, and found the price was his own soul.